Hi, this is Daniel from the-digi-picture.com. Welcome to today's tutorial. In this video we are going to talk about the exposure fusion technique. Exposure fusion is an alternative to the well-known HDR. The subjects of this tutorial are a short introduction to exposure fusion and why I use it for my images, a comparison of exposure fusion, HDR and manual DRI, and I'm going to give you an overview over the pros and cons of either technique. Then we are going to take a look at the tools available to do exposure fusion. These tools are mainly TuFusePro Pro and Photomatix. We are also going to process an example image with both tools, TuFusePro Pro and Photomatix, and compare workflow as well as results. In the end, we are going to draw a conclusion when it's better to use the exposure fusion technique and in which cases you should stick to the classical HDR technique. Before we start, I'd like to clarify a few terms and abbreviations. In case you're not familiar with terms like DRI, HDR or even exposure fusion, here is a short introduction. If you've been into photography for some time, you will know the fact that the dynamic range your camera can capture is limited. By dynamic range, we mean the difference between the darkest and the brightest spots in the scene that can be captured by the camera without over or underexposing. Now DRI stands for dynamic range increase and does exactly that. It increases dynamic range by merging multiple exposures of the same scene into one well-exposed image. No matter if we talk about DRI, manual DRI, HDR or even exposure fusion, they all work according to the same principle and they all share the same goal: create one well-exposed image from different exposures. Alright, back to the main topic of this tutorial, exposure fusion. Like already mentioned, exposure fusion is another DRI technique like HDR. But unlike HDR, it does not increase contrast, nor does it apply any sharpening or detail extraction. That's why this technique guarantees realistic results. Simply put, exposure fusion is another tool at your disposal to get the job done in case the dynamic range of a scene cannot be captured with one exposure. Before we start processing an example image, I'd like to provide a comparison between the DRI techniques HDR, exposure fusion and manual DRI. HDR is probably the most widely used of these techniques. It's an automated process where you feed your images into the software and the HDR program automatically merges the exposures for you. HDR handles extreme contrasts very well, and it can produce dramatic results with lots of creative possibilities during tone mapping. Another strength of HDR is ghosting removal. Ghosting can happen if certain objects in your scene move during the exposure. On the other hand, HDR bears the risk to create unrealistic images, and it needs lots of processing power because you work with 32-bit files. Because of its popularity, you have a broad choice of HDR tools available. Some examples are Photomatix, Francis HDR Pro, Aurora HDR and many more. Exposure fusion, like HDR, is an automated process. This means you load the images into the software and the program automatically merges the exposures for you. Perhaps the biggest advantage of exposure fusion is the fact that it produces very realistic results. This, by the way, is also the reason why I started to use exposure fusion. The reason why it produces such realistic results is the fact that it does not increase contrast, nor does it apply any sharpening or detail extraction. Another advantage of exposure fusion is the fact that it's less prone to ghosting. But on the other hand, if there is any ghosting, there are no ghosting removal tools available. An exception to this rule would be Photomatix, about which we are going to talk later. Perhaps the biggest disadvantage of exposure fusion is the fact that it struggles with extreme contrasts. This means even after merging the exposures, you might have to manually correct some over or underexposed areas in an image editor. Exposure fusion, on the other hand, is a very lean process. This is mainly because of the fact that it does not work with 32-bit files. This means, of course, that you need far less processing power. Sadly though, exposure fusion is not that popular. This means that there are not that many tools available. The tools that are available are ToFuse Pro, Photomatix, the Enfuse plugin for Lightroom, and of course the Enfuse command line interface tool. The fact that all these tools are based on the Enfuse command line interface tool and because of that use the same algorithm further narrows the choice of available tools. In order to complete this comparison, we also have to mention a third option how to create images with increased dynamic range. This is of course the manual DRI technique. This technique grants you full control over the creative process and lets you achieve complete realistic results. But manual DRI also means a lot of work, and the results you get are not always worth the effort. Manual DRI works best with scenes that don't need too many exposures. The more exposures you got, the more complex the process will become. What's more, manual DRI is fairly difficult. You need a sound set of skills and a lot of experience to successfully blend the different exposures in an image editor like Affinity Photo or Photoshop. That's why, in my opinion, most users are better off using automated tools like exposure fusion or HDR. Before we start the actual process of creating an image using the exposure fusion technique, I'd like to present you a short list of the tools available to do exposure fusion. First, there is the Enfuse command line interface tool. This tool is particularly important because all the other tools are based on this program. Because of the fact that I doubt many of you want to create your images using a command line interface tool, we won't have a deeper look at it. Next is the Enfuse graphical user interface. This tool is exactly what the name implies. It's a graphical user interface for the Enfuse command line tool. Sadly, I've not had any luck with this program. Whenever I tried to use it, it crashed. But it's a free program and there's no reason why you shouldn't try it yourself and see if it works for you. Next, there is a solution for you guys who work with Lightroom. The Enfuse Lightroom plugin. Since I don't own Lightroom, I've not had any personal experience with it. But from what I've heard and read, it's an excellent tool to do exposure fusion. Now it's time to present you the tool of my choice, TuFusePro Pro. This software is an excellent graphical user interface for the Enfuse command line tool, and it offers lots of possibilities to fine-tune the result. We are going to have a closer look at this program during the creation of an image using the exposure fusion technique. Last but not least, there's also Photomatix Pro. Photomatix Pro is special in two ways. First, it's actually an HDR software, but it offers exposure fusion as a tone mapping operator. And second, Photomatix Pro is the only tool to do exposure fusion that offers ghosting removal. Photomatix Pro is also one of the tools we are going to have a closer look at during the creation of an image using the exposure fusion technique. Okay, after all this theory, it's time to get to work. What we've got here is a photograph I've taken recently. It shows the Thur waterfalls in Unterwasser, Switzerland. We are going to fuse the different exposures to achieve a result like this. What we've got here is the TuFusePro Pro user interface. When you open the program, you're presented with this window, which gives you the opportunity to load your images. You click on Add and you select the different exposures. In this case, we would use these 4 exposures. But I've already loaded them into TuFusePro Pro. And the next step is we click on Configure Settings. This will open another window where we can determine the different settings for the fusion. If we click on the Preview button, TuFusePro Pro calculates a preview based on the settings we've chosen. The settings for the fusion are in the top right corner. We have a slider for brightness, we have one for contrast, for shadows, for highlights, for shadow floor and highlight floor. Plus, we have a histogram that represents the distribution of the tonal values. Let me explain how the exposure fusion and the settings work. In the top right corner we have the so-called exposure weight curve. This curve represents how the different tonal values are used to create the final image. On the x-axis we have the tonal values, and on the y-axis we have the weight of the different tonal values. So if we have, for example, a tonal value of 128, we can read here that the weight for this tonal value is 1 or 100%. Another example would be a tonal value of, let's say, 78, which is weighted at approximately 0.5 or 50%. And everything below 39 is weighted 0, meaning it does not influence the final result. Now what we can do, we can shift this exposure weight curve with the brightness slider, which shifts the entire exposure curve towards the left or the right end, depending on whether we want to make their image brighter or darker. But in this case we leave the value at 0. We have the contrast slider. The contrast slider makes the curve flatter or steeper, meaning adding or removing contrast. In this case we leave the value at 0.5. The shadow slider does control how much of the shadows will be in the final image. If we move the shadow slider to the left, more of the dark values will be used for the final result, and if we move it to the right, less of the dark values will be used. In this case we will also leave it at 0.5. The same goes for the highlights. We move it to the right and less highlight values will be used. We move it to the left and more will be used. Again, we'll leave the slider at 0.5. Then we have the shadow floor slider. The shadow floor slider determines which tonal values are used for the image and which are cut off. Of course, the shadow floor slider is for the dark tonal values, and if we move it to the left, we can see that more tonal values are cut off. If we take a look at the curve, we can see that the minimum is right now around 64, meaning only tonal values of 64 or brighter are used for the image, and everything below that value is weighted 0. If we move the slider to the right, we can lower that limitation. So, for example, if we move it to 0, we can see that the minimum value is around 28. In this image, we will leave the slider at minus 0.5, and we go to the highlight floor slider, which works exactly the same, but of course for the highlights. We can move it to the left and see that more and more highlights will be cut off, or we can move it to the right and see if we leave it at 0, we can see that all the values up to 233 are used for the image, and everything above will be weighted 0. In this case, we will also leave the slider at minus 0.5. We can click the preview button again to check the result, and we can see that we have a fairly good result. Now, if we take a closer look at the image, we can see that there is some overexposure in this area where the trees are lit by the sun. There's also some overexposure in this stream here and in the other stream below. What's more, there's some underexposure in the top left corner and in this area here. But that's no problem, because we can fix that later in the image editor. Before we continue, I'd like to mention a few facts concerning the sliders and settings. Of course, these settings are only suitable for this particular image. In order to save time, I processed the image earlier, and I now use the settings that I determined to be correct for this image. For your images, you simply have to try the different settings and see for yourself what looks best. Now, after you've determined the correct settings, you close this window, and in this window you choose a path and a file name, and when you're done, you click on Fuse Images. Again, because I'd like to minimize the waiting time for you, I've already prepared the image. If we look at the result, we can see the overexposure in this area, the underexposure in this area and in this area. And we can also see that the image lacks a bit of contrast and sharpness. But that as well will be fixed later on in the image editor. The next step is fixing the over and underexposed areas in the image editor, in my case Affinity Photo. For this, you go to File, New Stack, Add, select the relevant exposures and click on Open. This will automatically load and align the images, and after another click on OK, Affinity would open the images. But because I've already loaded the image, I click on Cancel, and we can see in the Layers area that only the base image, our Exposure Fusion, is activated. As you can see, we have two more layers with masks. We can expand these layers to show us the masks, and if we take a look at this mask, you can see that I brushed in over the underexposed area in the top left corner as well as over the underexposed area down here. If we activate the layer, we can see the result and the fact that the underexposed areas in the top left corner as well as down below are much brighter now. The same goes for the overexposed areas. If we take a look at the mask, you can see that I brushed in over the overexposed area in the top, also over the stream here, and the lower stream. Again, if we switch on the layer, we can see the difference, especially in the overexposed areas up here where the sun lights the trees. That's actually all that was needed to fix this area up here and this area down here, the area in the top left corner, as well as the streams. We can also check that if we activate the distribution of the tonal values, we can still see some underexposure here, but that's okay because that's not an important part of the image. It's more like a frame. We have the overexposed area here, which is now alright. There are only some small overexposed areas here, but that's okay. The same goes for the streams. There's hardly any overexposure left. So this image is now ready to be further processed. The further process is no different to any other image. You need to increase contrast, you need to sharpen the image, maybe correct colors and so on, but this has nothing to do with the actual exposure fusion process, so I won't bother you guys with it. The next thing I'd like to show you is the same process, but this time we will use Photomatix Pro to do the exposure fusion. When you've opened Photomatix Pro, you click on Browse Load and you select the appropriate exposures. You click on Open and you're presented with a short overview over the exposures. You click on Choose Merge Options, and since there is no ghosting in our image, we will untick the Show options to remove ghosts. We click on Align and Merge to HDR, and we wait for the process to be finished. As you can see, this is the big difference between the exposure fusion software TuFusePro Pro and Photomatix Pro, which is actually an HDR software. Now Photomatix Pro is creating the 32-bit HDR file, and we can click now on HDR rendering to get into the tone mapping mode. Let me quickly align the window, and now we can select Fusion Natural as tone mapping operator. This will do an exposure fusion and not add any contrast or sharpening as with HDR development. If we look at the image, we can see that it's already quite good. You can play with the sliders a bit. Let's not lose too much time fiddling around with the sliders and just use these settings. In reality, I would probably tweak the image some more, but it's already a pretty good pace to go on with. We click on Next, Finish. Photomatix Pro is now calculating the final image, which should not take too long. It's reducing chromatic aberrations, and there it is. As you can see, the image is pretty much the same as before. That's because, like already mentioned, all the exposure fusion tools with a graphical user interface are based on the same software and Fuse command line interface. Now, in order to conclude the process, you would simply click on File, Save As, and save the fused image as a 16-bit TIFF file into a folder of your choice. The next step, as before, would be eliminating the under and overexposed area in the image using an image editor like Affinity Photo or Photoshop, and then of course you would do your usual steps like sharpening, color correction and so on. Looking at the final result now, we can tell that exposure fusion is a very handy tool to create beautiful, realistic images. Exposure fusion gives you a great amount of control how the final photo will look like, without the excessive work that comes with the manual DRI process. On the other hand, exposure fusion does not replace other DRI techniques like HDR or manual DRI. It's in fact just another tool in your toolbox to create beautiful images and achieve the desired results. In the end, you will have to decide on a case-to-case basis which DRI technique works best for the particular image. Now we have reached the end of this tutorial. I hope I managed to give you an idea how exposure fusion works. If you still got any question left, please ask them in the comments below. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for more. Thanks for watching and goodbye.
just to go back to sleep, just to go back to dream, just for protecting myself from hate, compassion, reminiscence, fear, tears. Snooze and go back to a mind-safer state and avoid twice myself how to forgive her, how to go through, and then how to love again, right?